Hey internets. So there's a lot of philosophical concepts out there. Some of it is vital to understanding the true nature of humanity and its relation to the universe, and some of it, unfortunately, is complete mindless garbage that fully deserves the trash bin. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you a simple and straightforward life hack that will allow you to quickly judge if a philosophy package is worth your time or not. And I'm going to be using anti-natalism as a fantastic example of this particular brand of pseudo-intellectualism. Now, anti-natalism, for those of you who do not know, can be summarized as an ethical argument against procreation. In other words, stop having kids. The claim is that the pain of existence is far greater than non-existing and not outweighed by the pleasure that comes with existing. And therefore, by bringing children into the world, you are committing an act of evil because the non-existent individual did not consent to their creation. Thus, procreation, they argue, is logically equivalent to inflicting pain and misery on an innocent party. You can almost think of it as a very weird spin on think of the children, but by not having children because it might bring those children pain. Now, if you consider yourself a rational individual, you might already just have some alarm bells going off from that on its face. Something just doesn't feel quite right about that, does it? Well, that's where said philosophy life hack for detecting concepts that are most likely garbage comes in. And that is when one such concept suffers from relying on claims that are both unverifiable and highly subjective. To understand why both of these things together create some serious logical problems, let's look at a couple of concepts that only suffer from one of them. For example, the brain of that question, which is basically the idea that you are in fact living in the Matrix. That your entire reality that you experience is in fact being fed to you by a computer program, and the reality is in fact not real, but rather your conscious is real, your brain is real, and it's just hooked up to some machines, and those machines are feeding your mind all this visual and physical information about what's going on around you, but none of it's actually happening. Or another way to look at it is it's basically simulation theory. You have no way to verify of whether or not everything you're experiencing right now is really real, or just some illusion created by some machine that is hooked up to your brain in some other reality. Now, the shtick with the brain in the vat question is it is, of course, unfalsifiable. You can't actually prove that you are not a brain in a vat, at least not by any means we know of. You have no way of verifying that this is true or not. But the thing is, that's the point, because while the brain in the vat question is unverifiable, the entire reality of the question is just pointing to the fact that you don't actually have any way of knowing whether or not anything is true, with the exception of your own conscious will and experience of the world, which is an objective truth. Our entire experience in life is filtered through our conscious perception of that life, and thus your consciousness is the only thing you can really objectively know for sure if it exists or not. And thus the brain in the vat question is really just a philosophical question that points to this truth. Or how about an example where the concept is subjective but can be verified? For instance, the subjective theory of value, which states that you can't always predict the value of goods and services perfectly because that value is subjective to the people consuming those goods and services, which can change. Despite this, the subjective theory of value can, in fact, be verified. For example, consider the pineapple. How much would you pay for a pineapple right now? No, seriously, just think of a price. Now, do you believe your answer is the same as everyone else's? Of course not. Ask 100 different people or 1,000 different people or whatever this question and ask them to reason out their answers, and you will get multiple different responses. Some people love pineapples and would pay above the average market price. Some people are going to hate pineapples and wouldn't pay anything because they either don't like the taste or think it's too acidic, or a whole plethora of subjective reasons, as well as a few objective ones like food allergies. The point is, it can be verified though. You can do tests to verify the fact that subjective theory of value is real. Thus, we must accept the fact that subjective value represents a real truth about understanding human activity. So, in both of these cases I just mentioned, whether subjective value or brain in a vat, at least one side of the equation points to some kind of reality about how the universe operates that gives us something we can reason with. There's some kind of tangible truth to grasp from the darkness in those. But what happens when the foundation of philosophy has neither of these things? Both unverifiable and based on subjective ideas. Well, now we can get back to anti-natalism and start to see some immediate problems. This pain that anti-natalists are trying to avoid is subjective because pain itself is subjective. Some people tolerate it better than others. Some people are going to say that the joy they experience out of existing is far outweighing any kind of pain that they get from any kind of negative experiences in their life. And what's interesting is that the degree of this is also subjective. For instance, a person can experience a very crappy, very unfortunate life, but still say that they didn't get a small amount of joy in life, and still say that they are glad to have existed. While other people might have very easy lives with tons of pleasure or things that other people would value higher, but still say that they would rather have not existed. Pain is subjective and very difficult to verify. For instance, instance, someone could claim to have stubbed their toe on a fumo 20-something years ago, and they still have PTSD from it, and the pain they experience from it far outweighs any kind of joy they can get from being alive. Now, that may seem obviously ridiculous to the average person, but again, it's all subjective. You can't actually prove these statements wrong, you can only disagree with them in relation to how you would view it. So then, how do you know if a person who doesn't exist yet is going to be experiencing this subjective level of pain and pleasure in such a way that they don't mind and would rather exist than stay non-existent? Well, you can't verify that, because they don't exist. You can't actually verify if the absence or presence of pleasure or the absence or presence of pain has an overall value that favors non-existence to those who do not exist, because they don't exist and thus can't experience these things, and thus cannot give us an answer. The anti-natalist therefore contradicts their own premise by making claims that it is wrong to project our own subjective feelings of these subjective experiences to the non-existent, when the entire basis of their philosophy is doing this very thing. Sure, they might be correct that the non-existent did not consent to existence, but they aren't consenting to their continued non-existence either, because they don't exist, and therefore you can't verify their consent either way. And because the experiences we are arguing over here are, again, subjective experiences, there's no objective standard here by which we could even measure whether or not anything they are saying is true for any potential non-existent individual who has the potential to exist. This is the problem here with these things of being both subjective and unfalsifiable and unverifiable. Because there's no way to verify it, and the prime argument is based on how people subjectively value these aspects of living. There's really not much to go with here. There's no final truth of the universe to be grasped at here. Instead, all the anti-natalists are doing is they're just grasping in the dark at what basically amounts to pure nihilism with no real point to make. And when you go further and look at a few more arguments in favor of anti-natalism, this issue of grasping at subjective straws with no verifiable meaning and no way to prove it either way, and thus no substantial philosophical truth to be ascertained, comes up again and again. For example, take a look at this graph. Scenario A, X person gets to exist. They will have a presence of pain, which is bad, and presence of pleasure, which is good. Scenario B, X never exists. Absence of pain, which is good, absence of pleasure, which is not bad. Or is it? Define how bad the negative value of pain here is. Define how good the positive value of pleasure here is. You can defeat the argument this graph attempts to make by simply assigning -1 to the value of pain and +100 to the value of pleasure, and a value of 0 to its absence. Therefore, scenario A adds up to 99 and scenario B adds up to 1. Since all of these concepts are subjective, the anti-natalist has no argument against this refutation. And again, you can't actually verify these numbers for a person who does not exist. There is no tangible truth to be grasped here. You could argue with an anti-natalist about this forever and go round and round in circles, disagreeing with these values and debating with them until you are both blue in the face. For instance, the anti-natalist might say that the presence of pain a life might experience far outweighs the value of pleasure, and thus we should be conservative about avoiding pain, which is just the same subjective argument in reverse with no way to verify who is right or not. It would be a complete and total waste of your time. And this is exactly what anti-natalists do, by the way. One of their main arguments is the axiological asymmetry argument. And yes, there's an entire book on this from them. Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence by David Benatar. And the same problems are immediately present in the preface. For instance, it says, each one of us was harmed by being brought into existence. That harm is not negligible, because the quality of even the best lives is very bad, and considerably worse than most people recognize it to be. Again, there's the problem. The value of these things in relation to a person's life is subjective only to their own self-evaluation. Or how about in Chapter 3, how bad is coming into existence? I have argued for so long as a life contains even the smallest quantity of bad, coming into existence is harm. Again, that's subjective. You can only ask that on a case-by-case, individual basis, and you can't project that on someone who doesn't exist yet. What's interesting is he recognizes that this subjectivity is a problem because he goes on to argue against studies, which claim that most people are overall happy by pointing out that they are subjective, and people can be biased in favor of positive memories, and that their subjective answers may be correlated to other things. Yes, studies which ask people questions about their feelings on existential questions are going to have subjective answers, and self-reported data can indeed be the result of other psychological factors. And so he tries to argue against this using reasons that are, again, you guessed it, also subjective. It's like he recognizes that this is a problem, but only in relation to studies which disagree with his premise. The reality is, you can't actually make the claim that an individual would be better off even avoiding the smallest amount of pain by not existing, because you are not that individual. By even attempting to refute studies that survey individuals on these subjective statements, the book proves that the point of its own premise is moot, and that's the basic issue with philosophies that cannot be justified with anything verifiable or objective. The lack of both of these things means anyone can refute it by simply reversing it. Any justification they could possibly come up with can be just as easily be flipped around on its head to prove the opposite. Nearly all anti-natalist arguments can be reversed into pro-natalism. For instance, you can just say that the joy of life is a gift that far outweighs any pain. Pain is often forgotten and therefore is of little consequence. Therefore, we should have as many children as possible to bring as much joy into the world as possible. There is absolutely nothing an anti-natalist can say against these arguments that does not involve stepping on their own reasoning in some way, and this cancels out anything inside the anti-natalist position. In other words, these philosophies which lack verifiable or objective points can be regarded as shell philosophies. They have a claim on the surface about how we should live or something we should do, but all their justifications for it on the inside add up to nothing. They cancel out. So it tells us nothing about the reality about how the universe operates that gives us something we can reason with. There's no tangible truth to grapple with. There's nothing. There is only the claim it makes on the surface, a claim which it cannot give us a reason to care about. So what should you do when encountering an empty shell philosophy? Well, the answer is to stop looking at these unfalsifiable and subjective justifications for it, because that's just going to lead you around in circles. And instead, look at just its surface. Look at its shell, because on the surface, just about every philosophy does indeed have some kind of objective statement about what it at least is trying to say. Keeping with anti-natalism as an example, the claim that people should stop having children. Since the reasoning inside the shell cancels itself out, it instead makes more sense to look only at the surface of the shell and judge it by what is on that shell. For instance, utilitarianism. What would the effects be if everyone stopped having children? Well, any society which fails to replace itself at a 1-to-1 ratio at the very least is doomed to severe economic consequences, because there's no one left to maintain the economic production pipeline and services of that society that it relies on. So as the generation which decides to universally adopt anti-natalism ages out, this would cause a severe drop in quality of life for that generation. In other words, anti-natalism is a high time preference philosophy, in that it makes poor consideration of the future well-being of those who are currently alive. Another argument that comes from outside is the simple question as to whether or not pain and pleasure is really all that matters in life. Following the logic of anti-natalism, they would have no real argument against society dedicating itself to doing nothing other than sitting on a couch hooked up to various drugs to cause pleasure and dilute the suffering of passing. There are, unfortunately for them, in fact, philosophies out there which seek to obtain a form of enlightenment where neither pain nor pleasure nor desire can define their life's meaning. You could argue that those lifestyles are also reliant on subjectivity, but again, so is anti-natalism, so there's no reason to value said concepts any higher or lower than the concepts anti-natalism is pushing. There's also the issue that anti-natalism's premise must presuppose materialism to even begin to make sense. Non-materialist points of view claim that we actually do have a conscious existence outside of the one we currently experience. This means that in order to convince the entire human population to go along with anti-natalism, you must also somehow convince all the non-materialists that they are wrong. This is much easier said than done, since non-materialism is rooted in spirituality, which makes objective claims about what they believe the supernatural to be, but is also unfalsifiable, putting it kind of in the same category as the brain in the vat question. So yeah, good luck with that. Have fun trying to convince every religious or otherwise spiritual person that they are wrong. Spoiler alert, not happening. So realistically, anti-natalism in practice would actually just mean the materialists Darwining themselves out of the gene pool. There's also the problem of animals other than humans. Anti-natalism, pushed to its logical conclusion, must also conclude that any being with any level of conscious existence, or any sentience, must also be subject to the reasoning of anti-natalism of avoiding harm by not existing. And if you research anti-natalism, you will find out that many of them have indeed figured this out, and do indeed hold this very position. They actually do project anti-natalism onto creatures other than humans. So, how exactly are you going to convince every species on Earth to go along with this? I mean, forget trying to convince humanity of materialism, forget trying to convince any religious or spiritual people, and forget trying to get everyone to agree with an argument that is grounded in subjective and unverifiable. What about the rest of the jungle? And yes, they do need to convince them to go along with it. What's to stop the cats from rising up and evolving into cat people, with human-like intellect bringing us back to square one? Because you might have noticed there's still millions of years left in our sun's lifespan. All of this means that anti-natalism is effectively unfeasible and actually would cause much of the pain and suffering that it claims to be avoiding if put into practice. This is further emphasized by the anti-natalism community itself, which from what I have seen suggests to me that many of these people are simply adopting this philosophy as kind of a post hoc justification for something they have already decided to do a long time ago for completely unrelated reasons. Which brings me to the conclusion. When a philosophy cannot justify itself or provide any meaningful truth with any kind of verifiable or objective reasoning behind it, there's often a greater psychological reason behind believing in it, since there is no real reason to believe in it. This is the biggest reason why it is often a waste of your time to engage with the people who espouse it, because while this may not be the case with all of them, it is absolutely the case for some of them that their true justification for adopting this philosophy is not as noble as they would want others to believe. This isn't the case 100% of the time. There are rare cases where something can rely on subjectivity and make unverifiable claims, and still perhaps have some value. There are some esoteric theological claims which fit this bill and are, at the very least, interesting to look into, but the vast majority of time you run into something that fits the same bill as anti-natalism does, where all their justifications can be countered and debunked with the exact same subjective reasons that they are trying to use to justify it in the first place. It goes round and round, it goes nowhere, it's almost always going to be a gigantic waste of your time to even get involved with it. And that's why I have nothing further to say in this matter. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, tip me on Ko-Fi, and leave comments and all that other algorithm stuff. Till next time.